Hi everyone, so now we're going into another Arcane deep dive. This time we're actually going to look at a very interesting theme that kind of pops up from time to time in Arcane. And this is the idea of the battle of the generations. The way the old generation is dealing with the younger generation and not doing a good job about it. Now, obviously when you look at Arcane, the most like almost hit you by the forehead type of theme is the struggle between the top side and the undercity, the upper class and the lower class. Or you may look at it as like technology that slightly gets out of control. But what I see is kind of a more interesting side topic here is the idea of the generations and kind of the responsibility that they feel, but not always having an easy time passing the baton to the younger generation. Now, let's look at this. The most obvious candidate is Heimerdinger. Now, we're going to look at Heimerdinger and then we're actually going to look at Vander. In the case of Heimerdinger, he's been in charge of Piltover since its founding. Heimerdinger himself is over 307 years old at the start of episode 2. And he has his first run-in with Jace in the cell. And of course, there Heimerdinger is giving kind of a vague warning about, you really shouldn't get too deep into the whole arcane situation because, magic has, these scary things associated with them. And then further, of course, Heimerdinger gets really upset at the council when Jace really gets passionate about his research and about how hex tech and magic could really do good things. And again, Heimerdinger is kind of vague about the problems. I mean, you see the image here in the animation, but it's like listening to Heimerdinger talk, most of the people around him are not really going to realize, what's really the bad thing. It's just like, some old man saying some vague, you know, big boogeyman is going to ruin all of civilization. And none of the people there are old enough to remember any of the history of what really happened, or even if they remember some of the history, it's like probably in the history books. This is like, well, that doesn't matter. That doesn't relate to me and my situation. And the thing is, Heimerdinger is so incredibly vague about it that he doesn't really get into enough detail that people can really paint the picture or paint the horrors. Now, of course, at this particular time, the council is a little bit conservative because the council probably in Piltover is reasonably conservative about those types of things. If you're like in power, you don't want to do anything that really upsets the apple cart, and that is fine as it goes. But what ends up happening is that eventually Jace is able to produce really useful things from his experiments. This is all due to Mill's maneuvering. And so through that, of course, what ends up happening is that Heimerdinger gets thrown out of office and ends up wandering the streets of the Undercity to, at least for the first time, I imagine, finding out what's really going on. So it's like that's double whammy there. The guy just is not able to clearly articulate to people the problem of the technology, and he doesn't know enough about what's going on in Zon to at least alleviate the general current problems. And this is really horrible because when you think about this, Jace doesn't really understand, nor could he, the downsides of the magic. Because as a young man, magic saved him and his mom. And if you look at Victor, and this is really interesting here. Look, Heimerdinger has Victor as a freaking assistant. So Heimerdinger should know at least Victor's medical condition, or at least, you know, have some sort of semblance that Victor's time is limited. So Victor has a lot less time than Jay. So Victor is highly motivated to do something so that the work will move forward and that people's lives can be saved. And the thing is that Heimerdinger is just not available to pull back on research because he gets thrown out. So what ends up happening? Exactly what Heimerdinger had potentially, warned about, except he was so vague. So what did end up happening? What ended up happening that through the research that Victor had, Sky basically died. We ended up not just with tools that could help people, we ended up with weapons of destruction. You know, it was eventually going to happen anyway, the way things were going because of the tensions between Topside and the Undercity, the problems that were festering there that Heimerdinger had not dealt with. So you have that, and of course, you even have an even worse situation in the case of a weapon that was created by Jinx with a lot more firepower than anything that Jace had developed. This would be, of course, if you think about it, close to the nightmare scenario as far as Piltover is concerned. A huge, large weapon going towards the council chambers. You know, unless there's a miracle that happens, and there's a strong possibility that actually might happen, you have either the nuking of an entire city or at least the destruction of the government. Both are not really good situations, as far as I can tell. And this just shows a failure of imagination, a failure of leadership, and a failure of the older generation understanding the younger generation, how they feel, the fact that they don't feel there's enough time, the fact that they don't quite understand the danger of these types of weapons. Even though, Heimerdinger has the experience to know things could go really, really horribly wrong. And he knows it's his responsibility to, you know, get that across. It's just that he's unable to. And you see this in the case of Heimerdinger, but it's almost exactly the same thing in the case of Vander. Now, Vander, of course, has a slightly different lesson to tell, but it's almost completely lost on Vi in the long run. So, Vander pretty much, rises up against the kind of oppressiveness of the upper crust of Piltover, rightly so, most likely, and that ends up in a very bad situation. And of course, the next time the same problem occurs, he wants to make sure to calm everyone down, and not only that, he looks weak. I mean, even Vi was like, "Why are you just not doing anything?" And this was a problem. And so what Vander did was, of course, take Vi up to the bridge and, of course, depart the lesson of that violence, that war is not the solution. When you do these things, people are going to die. Who are you going to sacrifice? Is it Clagger? Is it Milo? Is it Powder? And of course, the thing is that Vi definitely didn't want that to happen, and you see the reaction. But the issue, to a certain extent, is that Banner didn't offer any alternative or solutions. So, to a certain extent, Vi got the message. She got the message that of the options that were available, she had to sacrifice herself in order to come up with a decent scenario to at least calm things over. And even if at this point intellectually she understood, you would think that at least at this point, when she impulsively, just full of emotion, slapped Powder, looked at her hands, and of course saw the blood that had come from Powder's nose, that, actually lashing out, punching like she had got up until this point, that type of reaction is not going to solve problems. It is only going to cause more problems. This is the lesson that Vander was trying to hit home with Vi. And kind of the story that Vander had told, and probably the other times that he may have lectured Vi, just did not get through. You can almost think about all the bad stuff that had happened happening again. Because what ended up Vi doing? Vi went to the council with Caitlyn. It didn't go well. So what did she do? She then got Jace together to, of course, beat the crap out of Silco. But this is an improvement. At least, we weren't going, hammer and tongs with Peltover. But the thing is, basically, from Vi's point of view, of course, beating the crap out of Silco, beating the crap out of Savika. I mean, is there an alternative? Maybe, maybe not. But the thing is, the cycle of violence was not ending. I was not actually looking for an alternative solution to punching the crap out of people, even though you would have thought that she would have learned, at least in episode 3, that punching people is not the solution. The only unfortunate thing you can say is that since Vi was stuck in prison for who knows how many years, that was the only thing that pretty much kept her alive and that solved problems for her. She didn't have any other way of getting out of problems. Even though this same problem that Vinder said we will not help you in the long run. It is just going to continue, and you look at this and you think, okay, season 1 is over and a lot of bad stuff happened, and you think, at least as far as Vi is concerned, maybe she will learn that lesson eventually, that not punching everything doesn't actually solve problems, it causes more problems. And what's really interesting here in this entire storyline of Arcane is a sense that some people do slightly get it. And why this keeps repeating is this scene right here. How even though the older generation, tries to deliver wisdom to the younger generation. Because, it's kind of interesting here. In this particular scene, Jace mentions that he was reminded of what the walls and the cannons and everything, what brought us together in the first place was the threat beyond our walls. And then Silco, who makes a lot of really great lines in this entire series, just says, the city has a short memory. And it does. If you look at the whole scene with the Undercity, when the enforcers were coming out and the people were upset, as they rightly would be, and really wanted to rough and tumble, is, Vander remembered, the carnage that happened on the bridge, and most of the people had already forgotten about that. Heimerdinger remembered, the entire problems that were caused by magic. And even though this is a city of progress, many people had forgotten the horrible consequences that magic had wrought, and will now pay the consequences of actually developing the weapons of that. And so, overall, this very fascinating and just wonderful story of Arcane kind of comes back to the incredible difficulty it is for the older generation to take their experience and the lessons that they have learned and relay them to the younger generation in a way that they can accept and use so that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. But it ends up that history, while it doesn't repeat, it does rhyme. And that can be a real sad and tragic fact. So I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.